A submarine descended into the Great Blue Hole to map the sinkhole in full 3D and confirm what researchers believed they already understood. But as the sonar data came in, that assumption collapsed.
Look at the sonar feed, section gamma. It's moving faster than anticipated.
Get me a level 3 analysis on that bioluminescence now.
The seafloor was not smooth or inactive. Deep inside a zone where nothing should move, survive or leave marks, the map revealed something truly unsettling. The discovery forced scientists to confront a frightening possibility. Something down there did not behave the way it was supposed to. The dive meant to finish an unfinished story. For nearly half a century, the Great Blue Hole sat in the Caribbean like an unanswered question that no one could finish asking. In 1971, Jacques Cousteau descended into it. He confirmed that below a certain depth, the water was lifeless, oxygen-starved, and hostile to anything that needed to breathe. Then he stopped, not because curiosity ran out, but because technology did. The deeper layers were left unmapped, unmeasured, and unseen. What existed below that cutoff point became a blank space in ocean science that lasted decades. That silence mattered because the Blue Hole was not just another dive site. It was the largest underwater sinkhole on Earth and geological scar that had once been dry land, then flooded, then sealed off by chemistry and depth. Scientists knew it was dangerous as it preserved things instead of breaking them down. But no one had ever captured its full shape. No one had ever seen how its walls bent inward, how its floor behaved, or whether the bottom was as dead and static as everyone assumed.
Underneath that, there's no oxygen, no life. And down there we found conchs and conch shells and hermit crabs that had fallen into the hole and suffocated, really.
The deeper story remained unfinished, suspended beneath hundreds of feet of black water. In 2018, that unfinished story finally drew a new audience. A new team formed with a narrow, uncompromising objective: map the entire Blue Hole in high-resolution 3D from rim to seafloor, using sonar precise enough to turn sound into structure. This was not a dive meant to impress tourists or produce dramatic footage. It was a technical assault on a place that had resisted clarity for nearly 50 years. The goal was to remove ambiguity by force of data and see what the hole actually looked like when stripped of darkness. Fabien Cousteau joined the mission carrying more than credentials. As Jacques Cousteau's grandson, he was returning to a place his family history had left unresolved. Yet this was not about honoring legacy, but about confronting a question his grandfather had been forced to abandon. The tools that didn't exist in 1971 now did, and Fabien intended to use them to push past the limits that had once stopped the descent. Richard Branson's involvement changed the scale of the operation entirely. He wasn't there to descend himself, but to remove any financial and technical constraints. With his backing came experimental submersibles, military-grade multi-beam sonar, and engineers capable of running deep-sea systems at the edge of failure. What might have been a cautious research dive now became a sustained, multi-day penetration into one of the most hostile underwater environments on the planet. At the center of it all was Erica Bergman, the submersible pilot tasked with navigating through total darkness, where visual reference meant nothing. Below a certain depth, there would be no light, no color, and no biological movement to anchor perception. Every decision would be made by reading sonar returns, pressure data, and instrument feedback in real time. A wrong interpretation wouldn't just end the mission, but could trap the sub in a space no human could ever reach again. With the team in place, the descent began with an understanding no one said out loud. If the Blue Hole had resisted explanation for this long, it wasn't because it was empty. It was because whatever waited below didn't reveal itself easily. And once revealed, it might not fit comfortably into what science expected to find. Thus, as the submersibles descended through layer after layer of the harsh ocean, it became clear the hole wasn't just deep. It was ancient, structured, and far more twisted than anyone had prepared for. Descending through Earth's hidden history. The descent started calmly, almost deceptively so. As the submersibles slipped past the brilliant blue rim of the hole, sunlight still followed them down, bending and thinning as the water deepened. From the surface, the blue hole looked like a perfect circle carved into the sea. Inside it, that illusion collapsed almost immediately. The sonar screens flickered to life, and the team realized they were not entering an empty vertical shaft. They were dropping into a massive internal structure, layered and complex, with walls that folded, widened, and constricted in ways no one had ever mapped before. Inside the cockpit, Erica Bergman kept her voice steady as she called out depth and heading, her eyes fixed on the sonar returns rather than the useless black beyond the viewport. Each ping painted a clearer picture of the space around them, and what it revealed made the room go quiet. The walls were not smooth but jagged, terraced, and deeply scarred, as if the hole had been shaped by multiple violent phases rather than a single collapse. Fabien Cousteau leaned forward, scanning the data feed, realizing they were watching Earth's history assemble itself in real time. Then the stalactites appeared. They emerged from the darkness like frozen spears in the form of enormous limestone formations hanging from the ceiling and walls. Some stretched more than 40 feet in length, far larger than anything that could form underwater. The implication landed instantly. These structures could only exist if this space had once been dry, open to air, and untouched by the sea. Long before the blue hole was flooded, it had been a vast cave system carved during an ice age when sea levels were dramatically lower. No one said it out loud at first, but the realization was heavy. They were descending through a place that had existed before modern oceans. As the sonar resolution sharpened, another detail began to unsettle the team. The stalactites were not straight. Erica adjusted the angle and ran another pass, thinking it might be a calibration issue. But it wasn't. The formations were tilted, some by as much as 12 degrees. That kind of deformation didn't come from erosion or collapse. It meant the ground itself had moved after the cave formed. The continental shelf had shifted, rotated, and settled, dragging the entire structure with it. The blue hole wasn't just a drowned cave, but a geological witness to tectonic movement. Fabien broke the silence with a sharp tone with disbelief. If the cave formed level and then tilted, it meant the region had undergone massive physical change after the fact. The hole had survived forces powerful enough to move land itself. This wasn't a static feature. It was something that had endured instability on a planetary scale. As the submersibles continued downward, the walls changed again. Flat ledges began to appear, wrapping around the interior like rings carved with surgical precision. Erica slowed the descent as the team marked each one. They weren't random shelves, but shorelines, ancient ones. Each ledge represented a point where the sea had paused, stabilized, and then risen again. The depths matched known climate events with disturbing accuracy. 69 feet, 161 feet, and 299 feet. Each marked a period of rapid warming and catastrophic ice melt. The blue hole was not just recording geological time, it was documenting climate collapse. By now the cockpit was tense. This wasn't a curiosity anymore, but a warning etched into limestone. The hole had endured cycles of warming, flooding, and destabilization long before humans ever existed. And now humans were descending into it, mapping evidence of planetary stress that felt uncomfortably familiar. As they passed the 300-foot mark, the instruments began to react before anyone spoke. Chemical sensors spiked and visibility dropped to zero. Erica felt it immediately in the controls, with the water itself had changed. The hole stopped behaving like a place where life struggled to exist. It became something else entirely. Because below that depth, the blue hole was no longer recording history. It was preserving death. The toxic barrier that froze everything in time. The shift happened fast. One moment the instruments were reading normally, The next, the sensors began flashing warnings. At roughly 300 feet, the submersibles crossed into something the team had been expecting but still weren't prepared to see. On the external cameras, the water thickened into a hazy yellow-green mass. It looked like fog suspended underwater, dense enough to swallow the beams of the lights almost instantly. Erica slowed the descent without being asked. Everyone in the cockpit knew this was the boundary. "This is it," someone said quietly over the comms. They had entered the hydrogen sulfide layer. From above, it appeared almost gentle, like a cloud hovering inside the hole. From within, it felt oppressive. Visibility collapsed to nearly zero, and the chemical concentration was so high it absorbed light, turning the outside world into a dim, featureless void. Hydrogen sulfide is lethal to most forms of life, and here it formed a thick ceiling that nothing living could pass through and survive. It wasn't just a layer, but a chemical wall. Below it, the oxygen readings dropped to nothing. Fabian stared at the sensor data in surprise. The oxygen meant no bacteria. No bacteria meant no decay. Whatever crossed this line did not rot, did not get scavenged, and did not disappear, but stayed. Erica adjusted the angle of the lights as the submersible pushed through the toxic cloud. And when the seafloor finally emerged, the effect was immediate and chilling. The bottom was covered in shells, thousands of them. Conch shells lay scattered in every direction, some piled against subtle ridges in the sediment, others resting alone as if placed there deliberately. These were not fossils, but intact shells with their surfaces unbroken, their shapes undisturbed. The animals had wandered too close to the edge, slipped into the hole, and descended into water they could not survive. They suffocated quickly, sank slowly, and came to rest in a place where nothing would ever touch them again. This was a graveyard. As the light swept wider, the pattern became clear. The shells were not random. They followed the contours of the seafloor, accumulating where currents had gently guided them before stopping entirely. Mixed among them were other sea creatures, fish, crustaceans, and fragments of coral, each frozen in the final moment of collapse. There were no bite marks, no signs of scavenging, and no breakdown. Death here did not lead to decay, but led to suspension. The silence inside the cockpit deepened. Then something caught the edge of the light that didn't belong. A plastic bottle drifted into view, resting on its side with its label still faintly visible. This was a sign that human trash was sitting at the bottom of a place thought to be untouched by time. Moments later, another object appeared. It was a small camera housing, unmistakably a lost GoPro. It had fallen years earlier and never moved since. The irony was brutal. Even in an environment hostile to all life, humanity had still managed to leave a mark. But there was something else that made Erica stop the submersible entirely. The lights tilted downward, and the team saw them almost all at once. There were two shapes, both of them unmistakably human. Two divers were lying where they had come to rest after disappearing years earlier. Their gear was still with them, and their bodies were preserved by the same chemistry that held the shells in place. Out of respect, the team limited the footage. The right thing to do was to notify the authorities. These were not relics of ancient history, but modern reminders of how unforgiving this place was. But even as disturbing as this frozen graveyard was, it wasn't what truly shook the team. Because beyond the bodies and beyond the shells, the sonar was picking up something else on the seafloor. Something that shouldn't have been there at all. And when the patterns came into view, the entire mission took a darker turn. The marks on the seafloor that should not exist. When the submersibles finally reached the bottom of the blue hole, the team expected nothing more than a flat, lifeless basin of inert sediment that had slowly accumulated over tens of thousands of years. Instead, the sonar feed hesitated, then redrew itself. Lines appeared where no lines should exist. At first, the pilots thought it was a rendering glitch, a software artifact caused by pressure or interference from the toxic layer above. The engineer on the comms asked for a recalibration. The image sharpened and the marks remained. As the external light swept across the seafloor, the reality set in. The sediment wasn't smooth but patterned. Circular tracks carved into the fine silt crisscrossed the bottom, looping back on themselves, intersecting at odd angles, then continuing on as if whatever made them had changed direction mid-movement. These were not faint disturbances but deep, deliberate impressions, pressed firmly into the sediment, as though weight had passed over it repeatedly. The room went quiet. One of the geologists broke the silence by listing the obvious explanations out loud. It was almost like a checklist, as if saying them would make one stick. Submersibles were ruled out immediately as the crafts hovering above the bottom had never landed or made contact. Plus, their thruster wash would have scattered sediment outward, not carved controlled paths into it. Someone pulled up the vehicle schematics on a side monitor, overlaying landing gear patterns against the tracks. They didn't match, not even close. Currents were the next suspect, but that explanation collapsed just as quickly. Below the hydrogen sulfide layer, the water was effectively dead. There was no circulation or turbulence. Instruments confirmed it again and again. There was nothing down there with the energy to drag sediment into repeating curves, let alone maintain their shape over time. If currents had been responsible, the tracks would have softened, blurred, or disappeared entirely. Instead, they looked sharp, preserved, as if made recently or frozen the moment they were formed. Falling debris didn't hold up either. Rocks fall straight down and bodies fall straight down. Even collapsed cave material leaves impact marks, not looping trails. These tracks curved and overlapped. Some even doubled back, crossing older impressions without disturbing them, suggesting separate passes made at different times. One of the sediment specialists pointed out something worse. The depth of compression implied sustained pressure, not a single moment of contact. Whatever caused the marks had weight, and it moved. Now it was time for the question everyone was avoiding. What kind of organism could survive here? When the biologist did, her response was quiet and unsettling. No known organism could. The hydrogen sulfide above acted like a chemical seal, and oxygen could not pass through. Complex life could not function below it. Nothing with muscles, nerves, or metabolism as understood by modern biology should be capable of sustained movement in that environment. Yet the evidence sat plainly on the seafloor. The team began marking coordinates, tracing the paths digitally, watching as the tracks formed no obvious pattern tied to feeding, nesting, or collapse. They were simply paths and movement for the sake of movement. And that realization unsettled them more than any single explanation could have. Because if nothing should be able to move there, and something clearly had, then the blue hole wasn't just preserving the past. It was recording activity that science had no framework to explain. Faced with marks that defied every known natural process, the team found themselves staring at a possibility they were unprepared to name and even less prepared to dismiss. Theories that made scientists uncomfortable. Once the submersibles began their slow ascent, the tension didn't ease but followed the team back to the surface. Inside the research vessel, the atmosphere shifted from discovery to unease. The tracks at the bottom of the blue hole weren't something that could be brushed aside with a quick explanation or a footnote. They sat on every monitor now, rendered in unforgiving three-dimensional clarity. You could rotate them, measure them, and trace their curves with a cursor. The more closely they were examined, the less comfortable the room became. The first explanation raised was biological. Extremophile life had surprised scientists before, as they thrived in boiling vents, acidic lakes, and crushing pressures. The biologists leaned into that possibility, pulling up comparative data on anaerobic organisms. But the argument collapsed under its own weight. No known extremophile could survive hydrogen sulfide at that concentration while also producing sustained lateral force. Microbes didn't leave tracks, and mat-like colonies didn't carve looping paths into sediment. Whatever made those marks wasn't drifting or growing. It was moving. Geology came next, and with it a brief sense of relief. Rock didn't scare people the way unknown life did. Slow sediment creep, gas seepage, pressure release from below each theory was discussed carefully. A geophysicist sketched diagrams on a tablet, showing how trapped gases might escape and disturb the seafloor. But when those diagrams were overlaid onto the 3D map, the mismatch was obvious. Gas moved upward and collapsed and radiated outward. None of it curved, doubled back, or crossed earlier impressions without erasing them. One of the engineers zoomed in on a section where 3 tracks intersected, paused, then continued in different directions. He didn't need to say what everyone was thinking. Random processes didn't behave like that. Physics didn't hesitate, change direction, and resume movement elsewhere. Something about the paths suggested adjustment in response to terrain, resistance, or obstacle. The word wasn't spoken, but it hovered heavily in the room. They circled back to instrumentation in the form of faulty sonar, mapping artifacts and software interpolation errors. The technicians ran the data again, stripping out layers, reprocessing from raw input. The result didn't change, even with different angles and different lighting simulations. Still, it was the same tracks, same depth, and same compression signature. The instruments hadn't invented the anomaly but captured it. Publicly, the team stayed disciplined. There was no speculation or language that could spiral into headlines. Press briefings stuck to phrases like unexplained sediment features and ongoing analysis. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. The senior scientist admitted that none of their models could reproduce the patterns. Another pointed out something worse. The tracks didn't look ancient. In an environment that preserved everything, age was hard to estimate, but there was no evidence of erosion, no softening at the edges. They looked intact and undisturbed. Then came the realization that shifted everything. Previous expeditions had reached the bottom before. Cameras had looked down there and lights had swept across the sediment. And yet no one had reported anything like this. The difference wasn't the location, but the method. This was the first mission to fully map the seafloor in 3 dimensions, measuring depth, pressure, and deformation at scale. The tracks hadn't appeared suddenly, but had always been there. They had simply gone unnoticed. Now they couldn't be unseen. The map was archived, duplicated, and sent to multiple institutions. Once that happened, the anomaly stopped being a local mystery and became a permanent record. Anyone with access could study it, argue over it, and question it. The data didn't allow for dismissal anymore. Lighting illusion was off the table, imagination was off the table. What remained was uncomfortable, unresolved, and stubbornly real evidence. Then someone asked the question that followed naturally from that realization. If something could move down there, undetected, for who knows how long, why had it left tracks at all? That single question pushed the discovery out of the realm of theory and into consequences no one on the team had prepared for. The mechanism that explained the tracks and made them worse. The explanation did not arrive as a moment of relief. It arrived like a verdict. When analysts layered the 3D seafloor map over chemical gradients and depth pressure models, a disturbing alignment appeared. The tracks sat precisely along a boundary zone where 2 hostile worlds met: the dense, toxic hydrogen sulfide water above and the compacted sediment below. This boundary was not a clean line. It behaved like a loaded surface, unstable, pressurized, and capable of shifting when disturbed. The sea floor, it turned out, was not being marked by something alive. It was being rewritten by something mechanical and relentless. The great blue hole, despite its stillness, is not isolated. Pressure changes from tides far beyond Belize, internal waves generated by storms hundreds of miles away, even distant seismic activity along tectonic faults. All of it subtly transfers energy into the hole's interior. When that energy reaches a threshold, the dense anoxic layer doesn't stay suspended. It slumps. Not violently, not explosively. It gives way in slow motion. What forms is a density current, An underwater avalanche made not of rock but of chemically lethal water heavier than anything beneath it. These currents do not behave like floods or waves. They crawl, they hug the ground. They move with persistence rather than speed, pressing downward as they advance, displacing sediment grain by grain. Where they pass, they do not scatter debris, they carve. This was the missing piece: the looping tracks, the repeated arcs, the overlapping paths. A single event could not produce them, but recurring slumps, triggered again and again over decades, could. Each movement followed the same low points, the same subtle contours, deepening earlier impressions rather than erasing them. That was why the tracks curved instead of fracturing, why they crossed without collapsing into chaos. The seafloor wasn't being struck, it was being slowly dragged. As the team studied the depth markers more closely, another realization settled over the room. These disturbances occurred after the hydrogen sulfide layer had fully formed. That meant the environment had already become lethal long after fish, bacteria, and scavengers had vanished. Yet the bottom was still active, still changing and still moving. The blue hole was not preserving a moment in time, but preserving a process. Overhanging ledges provided further confirmation. The underside of these shelves showed scoured patterns that gravity alone could not explain. Falling debris doesn't move upward, but density flows do. As they advance, they climb gently into confined spaces, pushing poison where no current should reach, stripping sediment from ceilings before sliding back down. The geometry matched perfectly, and the explanation fit too well to be comforting. The implications were immediate and grim. Anything that entered the lower blue hole, either as a diver, submersible, or equipment, did not simply risk suffocation. It risked being caught in a chemical landslide. These flows did not announce themselves or leave any surface disturbance, bubbles, or warning tremor. When they moved, they were buried, smothered, and sealed. And because the environment lacks oxygen, whatever they entomb stays exactly where it falls. The team understood now why bodies were found intact years later, and objects remained undisturbed. It was clear why the bottom looked like a graveyard arranged with intent. It wasn't intent, but repetition. The blue zone was a kill zone that reset itself quietly, over and over, without ever appearing active from above. The tracks were not signs of life adapting to an impossible place. They were proof of a system that did not need life at all, that was driven by pressure, chemistry, and time. It was one that continues to move even when everything else is frozen. The final truth was harder to accept than any unknown organism could have been. There was nothing to study, nothing to contain, and nothing to negotiate with. The blue hole didn't need to wake up. It never slept. The tracks were not made by something living. They were made by a mechanism that moves without eyes, without intent, and without mercy. This was confirming that the deepest part of the blue hole is not dead, not stable, and never finished with whatever enters it.